As we move up to medium, I think you're really starting to take that next step. So now more than likely you're going to have an office. You obviously have multiple people, so as well as people working from home and certainly the remote workers, you're likely to have an office. So you may have things like a switch, which will give you some networking. You might have a firewall, which will protect you a little bit from, I guess, people coming in from remote. So that makes the environment a little bit more complex. And so there's a little bit more that you probably want to do as far as protecting yourself against a cyber breach. One of the things that I was actually reading this morning on the way over to do this is there's a company or a research firm called Adept Research, and they've just announced they did a big survey of a whole heap of CISO, so Chief Information Security Officers. In 2022, their biggest recommendation is cyber training, and that's something that we think everyone should really look at. If you are going down the path of looking at the Australian government's ASD Essential 8, which is one set of tools that you can look at, it's only a free website that you can see, or many of the other different frameworks, cyber training or risk training is a massive part of each of those. So you definitely want to consider that. So with your training and with your cyber training more specifically, you want to basically get something that is ongoing, because obviously you'll have staff coming and leaving, you'll have new threats coming into the environment. I think a lot of people are pretty aware of things like the Australia Post threats, which will get an email making it look like Australia Post. Unfortunately, we've had clients that still click on those. But training is really going to help you keep up to date and work with that. Secondly, again, once you start talking about having multiple devices, and especially in this case, if you've got maybe a small server covering off some of the local things as well as Office 365, you're going to want to make sure that you're doing things like patching and firmware updates. So with both of those, managing that is a little bit tough. With the Australian government's Essential 8, they recommend doing things like critical patches within 48 hours. So you really need to have someone that focuses on that. And quite often, and certainly from a medium standpoint or an SME business, that kind of ranges from the 10 to 30 seats. You're not often likely to have a full-time IT manager. So that's something that does need to be done and does need to be focused on, and so that's patching. Next is once you start getting an office and you start having, say, a firewall and using things remotely, we also see in the Australian government's Essential 8, they strongly recommend having vulnerability scanning. And essentially vulnerability scanning is there to protect people that are coming in from the outside. So effectively they're trying to get into your environment, and by getting into your environment, obviously then getting access to your data. The way you want to test that is what we call vulnerability scanning, and essentially that is a tool that you would use which attempts to try and get in through those that firewall or into your server environment. Be aware as you do things like update or patch or put a new product on, every time that has some sort of component of external access, that will potentially change and have a loophole that gets created in the environment. So really critical that that gets done fairly frequently. In the past, in the last year or so, originally we were looking at a product that was doing it every quarter, but now in the Essential 8, they actually recommend daily vulnerability scanning because it's becoming such a large threat. The other thing that we kind of have a look at, if I keep going through the different things that I guess are important, is I guess aligned to ITIL-based framework, which is things like change management and asset management. So with change management and asset management, if we talk about ITIL specifically, but realistically any kind of reasonable sized business starts looking at this, is capturing and detailing things like, hey, I've put a new machine in, what are the details on the machine, what software running on the machine, so that way you can kind of analyze and understand what you need to do to cover that off. With asset management, again, that's in a lot of the security frameworks that talk to you about actually making sure you're doing a formal process to put a new machine onto the network, but equally take a machine off the network. So in our case, as a service provider, we have a long project plan for even every end user that comes and leaves to make sure that client's data is protected, and you're going to want to do something similar. The last two are kind of related. One is incident response plan testing, IRP. And for those that don't know, an incident response plan is essentially a process where you've got documented what you're going to do in the event of an incident. So in our case, we can help support by doing things incident response plan testing. And really what that is very similar to the fire warden test you might have seen in your current business. where someone will walk around at the moment and say, hey, Bob, you've got a fire under your desk, what do you do? And they run through the process. We use a very similar process to do incident response plan testing. Now, why is incident response plan testing critical? If you have a cyber insurance policy, it's really important that you understand what the process is to lodge a claim with cyber insurance. Otherwise, you risk getting that cyber insurance breached and them not paying out. So having an incident response plan would have things like all your contact details on who you need to talk to, what order they need to be talked to in. And so we'll run through that as a live table test and actually work in the business to see how well your staff actually understand what to do in the case of a breach. So hopefully if you do get breached by a cyber breach, you're actually protected and people know what to do. The last one is security policies, which is kind of part of I guess the incident response plan. It's kind of one of the first things we'd recommend creating as part of your security policy. But the security policy is very different to, I guess, what we're seeing for a lot of clients that have had, I guess, things created, back in the 2000s, where they'll have their internet use plan, or they'll have a acceptable use plan, maybe for their computers. This has to encompass a lot more things. So instead of being 1 or 2 policies, it's kind of typically 50 to 60. And I guess the best way of capturing those is doing that over a time and actually capturing those in there. So having security policies is really important. Back in the day when we started helping our clients with security policies, one of the things that kind of came up is we could write a big stack of security policies and hand them over. But the catch is when you're doing that, the issue is people don't want to read a 60-page document or a 70-page document. And so that didn't really work, and people didn't really take note of what those policies were. So instead, what we've found the best way of doing that is implementing 1 or 2 or 3 policies a month. For larger organizations, that might be between 4 and 6 policies a month, and you roll it out over time, get customer engagement, get your staff engagement, and then you actually see real change in the business.